The afternoon of February 23, 1945 arrived with deceptive calm on the black volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima in a concrete pillbox designated by Japanese engineers as Position 73 Alpha. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada and 11 men from the 312th Independent Infantry Battalion waited in darkness. They had ammunition for 3 days of fighting, rice for 5, and water for 2. What they did not have was any preparation for what was about to happen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 13:47 hours, Corporal James Hendricks of Charlie Company 1st Battalion 21st Marines approached the pillbox aperture carrying a device that weighed 70 pounds when fully loaded. The M22 Flamethrower consisted of 2 cylindrical tanks, a pressure system, and a wand gun with an ignition system at its tip. When Hendricks pressed the trigger, a stream of thickened gasoline ignited and traveled nearly 150 feet through the narrow firing slit of Position 73 Alpha. What happened in the next 4 seconds would be replicated thousands of times across the Pacific theater. It would become one of the most psychologically devastating tactical innovations of the island campaigns, yet it remains one of the least documented from the Japanese perspective. Not because it was minor, but because so few who experienced it directly survived to record their accounts. The story of how American flamethrower tactics evolved to terrorize Japanese infantry in fortified positions is not told through extensive enemy diaries or captured personal letters. Most of those were incinerated along with their authors. Instead, this narrative emerges from the convergence of American tactical development reports, psychological warfare assessments, the handful of Japanese survivors who provided testimony, and, most tellingly, the dramatic tactical adaptations Japanese commanders made in response to a weapon that violated every assumption of their defensive doctrine. The Japanese military had encountered flamethrowers before February 1945. German forces had employed them in the First World War, and the technology was not unknown to Japanese intelligence. What Japanese defensive planners had not anticipated was the systematic tactical deployment of flamethrowers as a primary assault weapon, integrated into combined arms operations with a level of efficiency and psychological impact that would fundamentally alter how infantry combat was conducted in the Pacific. Japanese defensive doctrine in early 1945 was predicated on principles developed through years of combat experience. The bunker, pillbox, and cave fortification system represented the culmination of Japanese defensive engineering. Concrete reinforced positions with interlocking fields of fire, multiple exits, and overhead protection against artillery and aerial bombardment. These fortifications had proven devastatingly effective against conventional infantry assaults throughout the island campaigns. On Tarawa, in November 1943, Japanese bunkers constructed with steel-reinforced concrete, coconut logs, and coral sand had withstood 3 days of naval bombardment. American Marines had suffered over 3,000 casualties taking an island of less than 300 acres, largely because Japanese defensive positions could not be neutralized by conventional weapons. Machine gun positions inside bunkers could pin down entire companies. Artillery could crater the landscape around fortifications without affecting the troops inside. The tactical problem was clear. American forces needed a weapon that could reach inside fortifications and neutralize defenders without requiring direct frontal assault. Explosives could collapse bunkers, but often left defenders alive in sealed chambers. Small arms fire could not penetrate firing slits at effective angles. Hand grenades could be thrown back or absorbed by tunnel systems with multiple chambers. The flamethrower offered a solution, but early models had severe limitations. The M1 and M1A1 flamethrowers used in 1943 had effective ranges of only 15 to 25 yards. The fuel mixture was thin and dissipated quickly. Operators had to approach dangerously close to enemy positions, making them priority targets. Japanese defenders quickly learned that killing the flamethrower operator before he could deploy his weapon was tactically essential. The transformation began in late 1943 with the development of thickened fuel agents. The Chemical Warfare Service, working with industrial partners, developed napalm, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids that, when combined with gasoline, created a gel-like substance that burned longer, stuck to surfaces, and could be projected much further than liquid fuel. This single innovation would alter the tactical calculus of fortification assault. The M22 flamethrower, introduced in 1944, incorporated thickened fuel and improved pressure systems. Effective range increased to over 100 feet, with maximum range exceeding 150 feet under optimal conditions. The fuel mixture burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and would adhere to concrete, steel, wood, and human tissue. Perhaps most critically, the flame consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces at a rate that could render a fortified position uninhabitable in seconds. The first systematic deployment of improved flamethrowers came during the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944. At Kwajalein Atoll, flamethrower teams from the 7th Infantry Division encountered Japanese bunkers that had been constructed with particular attention to protection against naval bombardment. These positions featured thick concrete walls, multiple firing ports, and elaborate tunnel systems connecting different defensive positions. Lieutenant Richard Morrison of the 184th Infantry Regiment recorded in his after-action report that conventional assault methods had failed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Against a bunker complex designated Target 17, 3 separate infantry assaults had been repulsed with significant casualties. Artillery had failed to penetrate the fortification. Demolition teams could not approach close enough to place satchel charges effectively. Morrison assigned a flamethrower team consisting of Operator Private First Class Donald Chen and Cover Rifleman Private Albert Kowalski to assault the position. Chen approached to within 75 feet and directed a sustained burst through the primary firing aperture. The flame stream entered the bunker, and, according to Morrison's report, within approximately 10 seconds, Japanese soldiers began emerging from secondary exits in various states of distress. Some were ablaze. Others were attempting to escape the superheated, oxygen-depleted interior. All 17 defenders were killed or captured within 2 minutes of the initial flame burst. What made this engagement significant was not the casualties, but what happened next. Morrison's report noted that after Chen's flamethrower assault, 2 adjacent bunkers that had been actively engaging American forces immediately ceased fire and attempted to surrender. The defenders had not been directly attacked. They had witnessed the effect of the flamethrower on the neighboring position and concluded that continued resistance was futile. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the Marshall Islands. Japanese defenders who had shown willingness to fight to the death against conventional weapons would attempt surrender or abandon positions when flamethrowers appeared. The tactical reports from this campaign caught the attention of Marine and Army planners preparing for operations against more heavily fortified objectives. By mid-1944, the United States military had produced over 14,000 flamethrowers of various models. Training programs at Camp Pendleton and other facilities were producing specialized operators at an unprecedented rate. The flamethrower was transitioning from a specialized weapon to a standard component of infantry assault tactics. The Japanese first began to grasp the implications of American flamethrower tactics during the Marianas Campaign in summer 1944. On Saipan, Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito had constructed an elaborate defensive network incorporating caves, bunkers, and prepared positions throughout the island's volcanic terrain. These fortifications represented months of engineering work and were considered among the most formidable defensive positions in the Pacific. American forces landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944, with the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, reinforced by the 27th Infantry Division. Each Marine Division now included dedicated flamethrower sections with over 40 operators. Army divisions carried similar numbers. This represented a more than 10-fold increase in flamethrower deployment compared to earlier campaigns. The tactical doctrine had evolved significantly.
Flamethrowers were no longer employed individually or in desperation after conventional methods failed. They were integrated into the initial assault plan. Tank infantry flamethrower teams operated in coordination. Tanks would suppress enemy positions while flamethrower operators advanced under covering fire to within effective range. The flame attack would either neutralize the position or force defenders into the open, where they could be engaged by supporting infantry. Japanese defensive positions on Saipan encountered this new tactical approach within hours of the landing. Bunker complexes that were designed to withstand sustained bombardment found themselves targeted by weapons that bypassed their primary defensive features. Concrete walls offered no protection against flame that entered through firing ports. Overhead protection was irrelevant when the weapon attacked through horizontal openings. Multiple exits, intended as tactical advantages, became vulnerabilities as flame and superheated gases traveled through connecting tunnels. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. A captured Japanese order from the 43rd Division, translated by Allied intelligence, directed that flamethrower operators were to be targeted with highest priority, before officers, before radio operators, before any other target. The order noted that the flame weapon created panic among defenders and that positions subjected to flame attack frequently abandoned their posts even when not directly hit. This was an extraordinary admission. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength and acceptance of death in service to the emperor. The concept of Bushido demanded that soldiers fight to the last man. Yet here was an official order acknowledging that a specific weapon was causing troops to abandon positions, implicitly admitting that some weapons created fear that overrode training and doctrine. More telling than the order itself was what happened next. Japanese engineering units on Saipan began modifying defensive positions specifically to counter flamethrowers. Firing ports were made smaller, reducing the aperture through which flame could enter, but also restricting fields of fire. Some bunkers had firing slits filled in entirely, with defenders instead relying on roof-mounted weapons that could be withdrawn. Tunnel systems were redesigned with right-angle turns and blast doors intended to prevent flame propagation. These modifications had limited effectiveness. Smaller firing ports still admitted flame, merely requiring more precise aim from operators who were becoming increasingly skilled. Roof-mounted weapons exposed operators to direct fire. Blast doors could be opened with explosives, and right-angle tunnels simply required multiple flame attacks from different angles. More significantly, the modifications took time and resources that Japanese forces increasingly lacked. The most comprehensive Japanese assessment of American flamethrower capabilities came from documents captured after the fall of Saipan. A tactical analysis prepared by staff officers of the 31st Army examined American assault methods and recommended countermeasures. The document, preserved in Allied intelligence, noted that flamethrower attacks effectively neutralized bunkers and caused heavy casualties to defenders. It also confirmed the psychological impact reported by American sources, describing chaos and panic among Japanese troops.
A translated form in the National Archives provides rare insight into how Japanese commanders understood the flamethrower threat. The analysis noted that American flamethrower teams typically operated in groups of 2 to 4 weapons, supported by infantry squads and often accompanied by tanks or armored vehicles. The effective range was estimated at 70 to 90 meters, though the report noted instances where flame had reached over 100 meters. The fuel was described as adhering to surfaces and burning with intense heat that could not be extinguished with water or sand. Most significantly, the report acknowledged the psychological effect. It stated that troops subjected to flamethrower attack often experienced severe morale collapse, that the weapon created terror disproportionate to its actual casualty-producing capability, and that positions attacked with flame frequently surrendered or were abandoned, even when physically capable of continued defense. The recommended countermeasures revealed Japanese understanding of both the weapon's capabilities and their own limited options. They suggested immediate counterfire against flamethrower operators, use of grenades to suppress operators before they could deploy their weapons, construction of positions with minimal external openings, and creation of multiple sealed compartments within fortifications. The report also recommended that troops be given training and indoctrination to resist the psychological impact of flame weapons. None of these countermeasures would prove particularly effective. Flamethrower operators learned to attack from covered positions and use terrain for protection. Grenades could not reach operators who stayed beyond throwing range. Fortifications with minimal openings sacrificed defensive effectiveness. Multiple compartments required more resources to construct and could still be cleared sequentially. As for psychological conditioning, no amount of training could prepare soldiers for the reality of flame entering their defensive position. The Battle of Peleliu in September 1944 demonstrated the maturity of American flamethrower tactics. The island's terrain featured coral limestone ridges honeycombed with caves, representing perhaps the most challenging defensive terrain American forces had yet encountered. Japanese Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded approximately 11,000 defenders who had months to prepare positions in terrain ideally suited for defense. Nakagawa had studied reports from earlier battles. He understood American combined arms tactics and had designed his defense specifically to counter them. Cave positions were constructed with multiple entrances and firing positions. Tunnels connected different elevations, allowing defenders to relocate under cover. Many positions had been blasted deep into solid rock, with overhangs that prevented direct fire from tanks or close air support. Against this defensive system, the 1st Marine Division deployed flamethrowers as integral components of every assault element. The Divisional Special Weapons Battalion included 8 platoons of flamethrower operators, over 250 men trained specifically in this weapon system. Additionally, tanks were modified to carry flame projectors, creating armored flamethrower vehicles that could approach fortified positions with reduced vulnerability. The tactical pattern that emerged on Peleliu would define the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. Infantry would locate and suppress a defensive position. Flamethrower teams would advance under covering fire to within effective range. The first flame burst would enter the position through the most accessible opening. If defenders did not immediately emerge or surrender, additional flame attacks would be directed into alternate entrances or openings created by demolitions. For positions too deep or complex for portable flamethrowers, flame tanks would be brought forward. The M4A3R3 Sherman tank, equipped with the Navy Mark I flame gun, could project burning fuel over 150 yards and carried sufficient fuel for 81-second bursts. These vehicles could remain outside effective range of most Japanese anti-tank weapons while delivering flame deep into cave systems. The result was systematic reduction of Japanese defensive positions at a pace that would have been impossible with conventional weapons alone. Positions that might have required days of fighting and significant casualties to reduce with explosives and small arms could be neutralized in minutes with flame weapons. The casualty exchange ratio shifted dramatically in favor of American forces. Japanese tactical reports from Peleliu, captured when command positions were eventually overrun, revealed the progression of Japanese understanding. Early reports noted the presence of flame weapons, but suggested they could be countered with aggressive fire against operators. Within days, reports became more urgent, noting that flamethrower attacks were causing positions to be abandoned and requesting guidance on effective countermeasures. By mid-battle, reports had shifted from tactical analysis to pleas for relief or reinforcement. One message from a company commander stated simply that his position was surrounded, that flame weapons had neutralized 3 adjacent positions, and that continued resistance was impossible. This message was extraordinary not for its content, but for its existence. Japanese doctrine emphasized fighting to the last man, with no expectation of relief or surrender. A message acknowledging the impossibility of continued resistance represented a fundamental departure from doctrine. Colonel Nakagawa survived until November 24, 1944, directing his defense from deep inside the island's cave systems. His final message before committing ritual suicide noted that American flame weapons had made traditional defensive tactics untenable, that positions constructed at great effort were being systematically destroyed, and that future defenses would need to account for this capability. The message was addressed to General Headquarters in Tokyo, but was intercepted and never delivered. The implications were becoming clear to Japanese strategic planners, though evidence suggests this
understanding came too late and was never fully incorporated into defensive planning. The principle of defending forward positions and fighting to the death from prepared fortifications was being rendered obsolete by a weapon that could attack fortifications from within. By late 1944, American industrial production had made flamethrowers available in unprecedented numbers. Over 21,000 flamethrowers would eventually be produced, with the majority deployed to the Pacific Theater. Training programs had refined tactics to the point where flamethrower employment was as standardized as rifle or machine gun tactics. The weapon had transitioned from experimental to conventional. The human dimension of this tactical evolution is difficult to document from Japanese sources for a simple reason. Those who experienced flamethrower attacks directly rarely survived to provide accounts. Those who survived often did so because they surrendered or fled. Actions that carried such shame in Japanese military culture that few would speak of them, even in post-war interviews. The limited accounts that exist come primarily from three sources: medical personnel, who treated burn casualties and heard their accounts before they died; soldiers who were not directly attacked but witnessed attacks on adjacent positions; and the small number of prisoners who were willing to discuss their experiences in post-war interrogations. A Japanese medical officer captured on Saipan, his name redacted in intelligence reports, described treating soldiers from a bunker that had been attacked with flame weapons. He stated that the casualties displayed burns over much of their bodies, that many had severe respiratory damage from inhaling superheated gases, and that several had died not from burns, but from asphyxiation in the oxygen-depleted bunker. He noted that the psychological state of survivors was one of complete terror, that they spoke incoherently about fire filling their position, and that several refused to return to underground fortifications even under direct orders. Another account from a soldier of the 109th Division captured on Peleliu described witnessing a flamethrower attack on a cave position approximately 50 meters from his own location. He stated that he saw American soldiers approach and direct fire into the cave entrance, that flame entered the opening and he could hear screaming from inside, and that within perhaps 20 seconds, survivors began emerging from a secondary exit. Some were burning, others were simply fleeing. His account noted that after witnessing this attack, his own position surrendered when American forces approached, specifically to avoid experiencing flame weapons. These fragmentary accounts provide glimpses of the human experience behind the tactical statistics, but they are insufficient to fully capture the psychological impact. What speaks more clearly is the behavior change observable in Japanese tactical decisions. On Iwo Jima, where the battle that opened this account took place, Japanese defensive doctrine underwent its most dramatic adaptation. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded approximately 21,000 troops defending an island of less than 8 square miles. He had months to prepare and utilized that time to construct perhaps the most elaborate defensive system of the entire Pacific War. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics extensively. He understood that conventional beach defenses would be destroyed by naval bombardment. He knew that forward positions would be subjected to flame weapons. His solution was to abandon beach defense entirely and construct a defense in depth utilizing the island's volcanic terrain. Over 11 miles of tunnels were excavated, connecting 1,500 cave positions, pillboxes, and bunkers. These were not simple fighting holes. They were engineered positions with multiple levels, ventilation systems, blast doors, and interconnecting passages. Some cave complexes descended 5 levels deep into volcanic rock. Positions were designed with multiple firing ports and numerous exits, allowing defenders to relocate under cover. This defensive system represented Japanese defensive engineering at its apex. It also represented implicit acknowledgement that conventional fortifications could not withstand American assault methods, particularly flamethrower attacks. By going deeper, creating more complex tunnel systems, and building multiple sealed compartments, Kuribayashi was attempting to design fortifications that could resist flame weapons. The attempt failed, though it succeeded in making the battle extraordinarily costly.
American forces landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, with over 800 flamethrowers distributed across assault units. This represented approximately one flamethrower for every 75 Marines in the landing force, an unprecedented density of deployment. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions each included dedicated flamethrower platoons, but additionally, flamethrower operators were distributed down to squad level in assault companies. Flame tanks, including both Sherman and the newer M5 Stuart-based flame vehicles, accompanied the assault waves. LVT-4 landing vehicles were modified to carry flamethrowers, allowing flame attacks to begin during the beach assault. Kuribayashi's deep fortifications required new tactics. Flame could not reach the deepest positions through a single entrance. The solution was systematic clearance. Engineers would identify position entrances. Flamethrower teams would attack through every accessible opening simultaneously. If flame and conventional explosives could not reach deep enough, engineers would seal entrances with demolitions and bulldozers, entombing defenders alive. The brutality of this method was a direct function of the defensive system's sophistication. Positions too deep to assault directly had to be bypassed and sealed. Tunnel complexes that allowed defenders to relocate under cover
had to be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The more elaborate the Japanese fortifications, the more thorough and devastating the American response. Sergeant Yamada, mentioned at this account's opening, survived the initial flamethrower attack on position 73 Alpha. He and 4 others escaped through a secondary tunnel before flame filled their fighting position. They relocated to a deeper position in the tunnel complex. Over the next 6 days, they experienced 3 more flamethrower attacks as American forces systematically cleared the tunnel network. Yamada surrendered on March 1, 1945, one of only 3 survivors from his original position. His interrogation report, preserved in Marine Corps historical records, provides one of the most detailed Japanese accounts of experiencing flamethrower warfare. He described the first attack as creating an explosion of fire that filled the bunker's main chamber instantly. The heat was so intense that metal fixtures became too hot to touch. The air became unbreathable. The noise of the flame projector and the roar of burning fuel made communication impossible. In the secondary position, he described the psychological state of his group as one of constant terror. They knew American forces were above them. They could hear demolitions and feel vibrations from machinery. The possibility that flame would suddenly enter their position dominated every thought. When it happened again, the group immediately fled deeper into the tunnels without attempting to defend the position. Yamada's account included an observation that appears in other captured testimonies. He stated that traditional weapons, artillery, bombs, even the American rockets, these created fear but also resolved to fight back. The flamethrower created only the desire to escape. There was no defense, no way to fight back, only the choice between burning or fleeing. This psychological assessment, repeated across multiple sources, suggests the flamethrower achieved something beyond tactical effectiveness. It created a form of existential terror that conventional weapons could not produce. The statistical evidence supports this psychological assessment. On Iwo Jima, Japanese forces fought with exceptional determination. The battle lasted 36 days. American casualties exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Japanese forces fought with virtually no possibility of relief or evacuation. Yet prisoner statistics reveal a notable pattern. Positions subjected to flamethrower attack produced prisoners at significantly higher rates than positions reduced by conventional weapons. While overall Japanese surrender rates remained low, they were measurably higher in sectors where flamethrowers were employed heavily. Areas where flame tanks operated saw the highest prisoner rates. This pattern held even when controlling for other factors, such as the stage of battle and unit composition. The Marine Corps Board study conducted after Iwo Jima analyzed tactical effectiveness of different weapons and methods. The study found that flamethrowers were the single most effective weapon for neutralizing fortified positions.
a bunker that might require multiple tank rounds, dozens of artillery shells, and significant infantry casualties to reduce with conventional weapons, could typically be neutralized with 1 or 2 flame attacks and minimal casualties to attacking forces. More significantly, the study found that the psychological effect extended beyond positions directly attacked. Units adjacent to positions hit with flamethrowers showed decreased combat effectiveness and higher surrender rates even when not directly subjected to flame weapons themselves. The mere knowledge that flamethrowers were being employed in their sector affected unit cohesion and willingness to defend positions to the death. This finding had profound implications for the planned invasion of Japan. If flamethrower warfare was reducing Japanese willingness to fight to the death on isolated islands, where surrender meant capture and likely execution, what effect might it have on the home islands, where defenders might reasonably expect better treatment if they surrendered? The strategic planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan, incorporated flamethrower warfare at a scale never before contemplated. Staff officers calculating requirements for the invasion of Kyushu estimated that over 40,000 flamethrowers would be needed across all assault forces. This represented more than double the total number produced for the entire war to that point. The assumption driving these calculations was that Japanese home island defenses would be even more elaborate than Iwo Jima, and that flame weapons would be essential for reducing fortifications without prohibitive casualties. Intelligence assessments conducted in spring 1945 examined Japanese defensive preparations on Kyushu and Honshu. Aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence revealed massive fortification efforts. Caves were being excavated throughout mountainous terrain. Coastal defense positions were being constructed with reinforced concrete. Urban areas were being prepared for defense with buildings converted into strongpoints. The scale of preparation suggested that Japanese planners anticipated fighting from fortified positions as the primary defensive strategy. What Japanese planners may not have fully grasped was how thoroughly American forces had refined flamethrower tactics specifically to counter fortified defense. The lessons from Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima had been systematically analyzed and incorporated into training and doctrine. By mid-1945, flamethrower employment was as routine as rifle fire in American assault tactics. New operators were being trained at rates exceeding 500 per month. Equipment production had been scaled to provide unlimited replacement capacity. The technical evolution continued even as planning progressed. The M97 flamethrower, introduced in early 1945, featured improved fuel capacity, extended range approaching 200 feet under optimal
conditions, and a more reliable ignition system. Armored flamethrower vehicles were being produced in greater numbers, with variants based on multiple chassis types. Experiments with aerial delivery of napalm had resulted in dedicated incendiary bombs that could spread burning gel over wide areas, essentially creating mass flamethrower effects from aircraft. Japanese intelligence was aware of American flamethrower capabilities by 1945, though evidence suggests they significantly underestimated both the scale of deployment and the psychological effectiveness. Captured documents from Japanese military headquarters included technical analyses of flamethrower systems based on captured examples and battlefield observations. These analyses correctly identified fuel composition, operating mechanisms, and approximate performance characteristics. What they failed to capture was the systematic integration of flame weapons into assault doctrine and the cumulative psychological impact on defending forces. A Japanese Army training manual updated in March 1945, captured after the surrender and translated by occupation forces, included a section on countering flame weapons. The manual recommended that soldiers facing flamethrower attack should maintain position, use covering fire to suppress operators, and employ grenades against approaching assault teams. It suggested that well-constructed fortifications with proper ventilation could withstand flame attacks, and that disciplined troops should not abandon positions when subjected to flame weapons. This guidance reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of both the weapon's capabilities and its psychological impact. Well-constructed fortifications with proper ventilation were precisely what flamethrowers had been designed to defeat. The ventilation systems that were supposed to protect against gas attack provided pathways for flame and superheated gases to penetrate deep into fortified positions. Disciplined troops maintaining position in the face of flame attacks had consistently been killed or forced to surrender across every battle where flamethrowers were employed. The manual's recommendations revealed something more significant than tactical error. They suggested that Japanese command either did not believe reports of flamethrower effectiveness or chose not to acknowledge them in official doctrine. This disconnect between battlefield reality and official guidance would have profound consequences for Japanese forces preparing to defend the home islands. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning April 1, 1945, provided the final large-scale demonstration of American flamethrower tactics before the planned invasion of Japan. The island's terrain and Japanese defensive preparations made it perhaps the most relevant template for what invasion forces might encounter on Kyushu. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded over 100,000 troops, a mix of regular army units, naval personnel, and local conscripts organized into the 32nd Army. Ushijima had studied American tactics extensively. His defensive plan explicitly acknowledged American combined arms capabilities and attempted to design a defense that would maximize casualties while accepting eventual defeat. The strategy centered on defense in depth, utilizing Okinawa's southern terrain, a landscape of ridges, ravines, and limestone escarpments that provided natural fortification enhanced by extensive engineering work. American forces landed with over 77,000 troops in the initial assault, eventually building to over 180,000. The density of flamethrower deployment exceeded even Iwo Jima. The 10th Army, commanding ground forces, had integrated flamethrowers into every assault unit. Each Marine and Army division included multiple flamethrower platoons. Flame tanks operated with every armored unit. Portable flamethrowers were distributed to rifle companies and in some cases to individual squads. The battle developed into a grinding campaign of fortification reduction that lasted 82 days. Japanese defensive positions in the Shuri Line and subsequent defensive positions southward represented the most sophisticated fortification network American forces had encountered. Cave systems extended hundreds of yards into solid rock. Positions had multiple levels with interconnecting tunnels. Ventilation shafts provided air circulation. Storage chambers held ammunition and supplies for extended defense. Against this defensive system, flame weapon tactics had evolved to industrial-scale efficiency. The pattern became routine. Reconnaissance elements would identify defensive positions. Artillery and airstrikes would suppress observed firing positions. Infantry would advance with tank support to within assault range. Flamethrower teams would systematically attack every identified entrance or opening. Engineers would seal positions that could not be directly assaulted. The entire process would then repeat for the next position. The scale of flame weapon employment at Okinawa exceeded all previous battles combined. Marine and Army units collectively expended over 1 million gallons of flamethrower fuel during the campaign. Flame tanks fired thousands of bursts into cave positions. Portable flamethrower operators conducted tens of thousands of individual attacks against fortified positions. The island's limestone terrain, initially seen as advantageous for defense, proved particularly vulnerable to flame weapons as cave systems channeled fire and heat deep into defensive complexes.
Acknowledged that continued defense was inflicting casualties on American forces, but that eventual defeat was inevitable. One report from a battalion commander in the 24th Division, dated June 3, 1945, stated that his unit had been reduced from approximately 600 effectives to fewer than 100. He noted that conventional weapons, including artillery and airstrikes, had caused some casualties, but that flamethrower attacks had been most devastating. Positions that had taken weeks to prepare were being neutralized in minutes. Survivors of flame attacks were often too traumatized to effectively man new positions. The report concluded that flame weapons had made traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. This assessment from a field commander experiencing the reality of flamethrower warfare stood in stark contrast to the optimistic guidance in official training manuals. The disconnect reflected a broader pattern in Japanese military culture, where negative information was often suppressed or minimized in official communications. Field commanders understood they were facing a weapon that negated their primary defensive advantage, but this understanding was not being effectively communicated to higher command or incorporated into planning. The psychological dimension of flamethrower warfare became increasingly apparent as the Okinawa campaign progressed. Medical personnel treating both American and Japanese casualties observed distinct patterns. Japanese soldiers captured after experiencing flamethrower attacks showed signs of severe psychological trauma beyond what was typical even for intense combat. American psychiatrists treating combat fatigue in their own forces noted that flamethrower operators had unusually high rates of psychological stress, suggesting that even those wielding flame weapons were affected by their devastating effects. A psychological warfare assessment prepared by 10th Army intelligence staff analyzed prisoner interrogations and captured documents to understand the impact of flame weapons on Japanese morale. The assessment concluded that flamethrowers created terror disproportionate to their actual casualty rates, that units subjected to flame attacks showed measurably decreased combat effectiveness, and that knowledge of flamethrower employment in a sector increased surrender rates among Japanese forces. The assessment recommended increased psychological operations, emphasizing American flamethrower capabilities. Leaflets were prepared showing graphic images of flame weapon effects and offering surrender as the alternative to incineration. Loudspeaker broadcasts described in detail what soldiers could expect if their positions were attacked with flame weapons. The goal was to leverage the psychological impact of flamethrowers beyond their direct tactical employment. Evidence of effectiveness remains ambiguous. Japanese surrender rates on Okinawa remained low compared to European theaters, with most of the 32nd Army fighting to the death. However, surrender rates were measurably higher than earlier Pacific battles, and prisoners consistently cited fear of flame weapons as a factor in their decision to surrender. Whether psychological operations contributed significantly, or whether this was simply the cumulative effect of experiencing flamethrower warfare, is difficult to determine from available evidence. What is clear is that by June 1945, American forces had perfected a system of fortification warfare that made Japanese defensive doctrine fundamentally unviable. Prepared positions that Japanese doctrine assumed could be held indefinitely were being reduced systematically and efficiently. The casualty exchange ratio, long favorable to defenders in fortification warfare, had shifted decisively toward attackers employing flame weapons. The implications for the defense of Japan were profound. Japanese military planning for homeland defense in summer 1945 faced an impossible problem. Intelligence indicated that American forces would employ flamethrowers at unprecedented scale during any invasion. Defensive doctrine was predicated on fortified positions that flamethrowers had proven capable of neutralizing. Alternative defensive strategies were limited by geography, resources, and military culture. The Katsugo Defense Plan, Japan's strategy for defending the home islands, called for approximately 3 million military personnel and 28 million civilian militia to defend against invasion. The plan emphasized defense of likely landing beaches on Kyushu and Kanto Plain, with secondary defenses to rout both islands. Fortification construction was prioritized, with extensive cave systems being excavated and urban areas prepared for defense. This strategy represented doubling down on the very approach that flamethrowers had been designed to defeat. Intelligence assessments conducted by American planners noted this apparent contradiction. Japanese forces were preparing elaborate fortifications while having extensive evidence that such fortifications were vulnerable to flame attack. The assessment concluded either the Japanese planners believed they could develop effective countermeasures or that they had no alternative strategy given their military doctrine and available resources. Captured documents suggest both factors were present. Some Japanese planning documents from this period include references to countermeasures against flame weapons, including wider spacing of positions to prevent multiple positions being attacked in sequence, construction of decoy positions to draw flame attacks, and training of special assault teams to target flamethrower operators. Other documents acknowledge that no fully effective countermeasure existed and that defense would necessarily accept high casualties while attempting to inflict maximum losses on invading forces. The decision to employ atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered these defensive preparations moot. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, without the invasion of the home islands taking place. The flamethrower tactics that had been perfected through years of island warfare would never be tested against the massive defensive preparations on Kyushu.
Honshu. The counterfactual question of how flame weapons would have performed in the invasion of Japan remains one of history's great unknowns. Staff estimates prepared for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu, projected that flamethrower employment would be essential for reducing fortified positions, but that casualties would nevertheless be severe due to the density and depth of Japanese defenses. The psychological impact that had been so pronounced on isolated islands might have been less effective when defending troops were fighting for their homes and families rather than remote territories. What is documented is the planning that occurred. Production schedules called for 40,000 flamethrowers to be delivered for Olympic, with sufficient fuel stocks for sustained operations. Training programs were expanded to produce thousands of additional operators. Flame tanks were being produced at maximum industrial capacity. Incendiary bombing capabilities were being enhanced with improved napalm formulations. The American military was preparing to wage flame warfare at a scale that would have dwarfed anything seen in the island campaigns. Japanese defensive preparations revealed awareness of this threat. Cave systems being excavated on Kyushu in summer 1945 incorporated design features apparently intended to counter flame attacks. Some included multiple sealed compartments with blast doors, ventilation systems with filters and baffles, and water reservoirs for firefighting. Whether these modifications would have proven effective can never be known, though experience from earlier battles suggests they would at best have made positions more difficult to reduce rather than immune to flame attack. The human cost of the flamethrower war in the Pacific can be calculated in multiple ways. American flamethrower operators suffered casualty rates higher than average infantry, reflecting the dangerous nature of their role. Carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable fuel while advancing toward enemy positions made operators priority targets. Statistical analyses of casualty data shows flamethrower operators had roughly 50% higher casualty rates than riflemen in the same units during assault operations. Japanese casualties from flame weapons are harder to quantify precisely. Medical records and casualty reporting from Japanese forces were fragmentary and often destroyed. Post-war analyses estimated that flame weapons directly caused between 15,000 and 20,000 Japanese combat deaths across the Pacific campaigns. However, this figure captures only direct casualties and excludes those who died from burns after being evacuated, from smoke inhalation in sealed positions, or who were killed by other weapons after flame attacks forced them from fortifications. More significant than direct casualties was the broader impact on defensive effectiveness. Positions attacked with flame weapons typically ceased effective resistance within minutes rather than the hours or days that conventional reduction might require. This time compression translated directly into reduced American casualties during assault operations. Statistical analyses conducted by military operations research teams estimated that flamethrower employment reduced American casualties in fortification assault by 30 to 40% compared to conventional methods. The psychological casualties, both Japanese and American, are even harder to quantify but were significant. Japanese prisoners who experienced flame attacks often exhibited severe psychological trauma. American flamethrower operators, despite their tactical effectiveness, had elevated rates of combat fatigue and post-traumatic stress. The nature of the weapon, intimate, horrifying, unmistakably personal in its effects, affected those who wielded it as well as those who faced it. Post-war interviews with American flamethrower operators reveal complex and often troubled relationships with their wartime role.
Many expressed pride in their tactical effectiveness and believed they had saved lives by reducing the duration and cost of battles. Others struggled with the nature of what they had done, the intimate horror of burning other human beings alive. Some described recurring nightmares decades after the war ended. The psychological burden of flamethrower warfare was not limited to those on the receiving end. The ethical dimensions of flamethrower warfare were debated even during the war, though these debates were largely confined to military and policy circles rather than public discourse. International law regarding weapons of war was less developed in 1945 than it would later become. But some military legal experts questioned whether flame weapons constituted unnecessary suffering under existing conventions. These concerns were generally overridden by military necessity arguments. Flame weapons were tactically effective, they reduced friendly casualties, and they were being used against an enemy that showed no inclination to surrender. Japanese perspectives on the ethics of flamethrower warfare are largely absent from the historical record. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.